So I've just had a shave, and as I often do, as I was shaving, I was listening to some music. Lonnie Donegan CD. If you're not familiar with Lonnie Donegan, he was a popular artist in the 50s. He died, I believe, in the early 2000s, but he was very popular in the 50s and early 60s as a country and skiffle singer. He was actually from Glasgow, but is known for American kind of folk music. Um, so in a sense, he was a British export to the United States, a bit like Cary Grant in that sense. Um, as a child, my family used to play a lot of Lonnie Donegan. One of my memories, we had a holiday house in the Isle of Magee Peninsula in Northern Ireland, and my parents used to play Lonnie Donegan, among other classics like Crystal Gale and Dolly Parton, people like that, on the car radio. So I was listening to a bit of Lonnie Donegan just now. I like Lonnie Donegan, like most of his stuff, although some of it's a bit cheesy, definitely a bit dated by today's standards. Some lyrics are even a bit silly, but it was fun and it was catchy. Um, Anyway, I was looking at a little clip just now on an old show from, I guess, well, it's old now. I guess it would be from the 80s or early 90s, presented by Michael Aspel, and the title of the show is The Problem with the 50s. You can find this on YouTube. And it had a little clip of Lonnie Donegan. Of course, he was one of the big stars of that era. And he came out with a statement that in the 50s, kids just went out to have fun and no one went out to get have fights and become rich and famous. Well, greatest respect to Lonnie Donegan, that's debatable. But anyway, it got me thinking about an issue about generations, and particularly this idea about the good old days. Now, I'm a millennial, and that's not a political statement. It shouldn't be. People seem to think that the idea of millennial is actually some sort of ideology. It's not. It's just the time you were born. So anyone born between 1983 and approximately 1999, whether they're left wing or right wing, is a millennial. That's just the generation we are part of. So it's not something like, oh, I'm against millennials because they're snowflakes. Well, if you're under the age of, say, 38, you are a millennial, whether you like it or not. So to me, that's a bit silly. Nevertheless, generations do get defined by particular trends or particular ideologies. So, for example, we think of the baby boomers, we tend to associate them with the counterculture movement of the 50s and 60s. Um, with my generation, absolutely, it is associated with, frankly, identity politics, political correctness, and people being too sensitive. And I think that's a great pity because there is a lot more to it. It's an aspect of my generation I deeply dislike. I've been pretty candid about my thoughts on how identity politics can divide people, and I'm very concerned about the overt sensitivity coming into our universities under the guise of tolerance. In that sense, it's an aspect of my generation that is definitely not good. But here's the thing: I don't think you can dismiss any generation in a positive or negative way. So I'm not going to join those who say, "Oh, well, the good old days, everything was better, and there wasn't these problems then." There may not have been the problems that we have today. For example, you're not going to have in the past the problems we now associate with social media, very much part of this generation. Um, but there was other problems. Mental health was less discussed in the past, for example. Um, so I don't endorse this view that you can dismiss an entire generation as good or bad. BuzzFeed had a video. Now, disclaimer here, I'm not a fan of BuzzFeed. I find it represents a lot of the sort of identitarian politics that I dislike. I find it's pretty biased to the political left. For the most part, I don't have time for it. However, they did produce a particularly good video called Generation Through Time. Now, the reason I say it was a good video is it was memorable. I like the background music. I'm not sure what they were using, but it worked really well. Um, and I went through all the generations from basically through the 20th century, uh, just before the greatest generation, which is, of course, defined as those who came of age during the Second World War, silent generation, which was those who were too young to be in the Second World War, but too old to be baby boomers. Baby boomers, Generation Z, the millennials. We're now getting into excuse me, I should say Generation X millennials. Now we're getting into Generation Z and so-called Homeland Generation. All these are American terminology. But the video was very well done. I'll try and put a link under this because it was done in such a way as these are the events that shaped and formed this particular generation. So with the greatest generation, it was the sacrifices of World War II. They're called the greatest generation, but they had no choice. They had this monumental world-changing event that no human being on earth wasn't affected by. Then you had the baby boomers defined by, well, they had the silent generation, which were very socially conservative. This was the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, the period of the Red Scare in the United States. People wanted to be seen as establishment, as pro-government. Then you had a radical shift from that by the late 60s, the counterculture movement, which had its origins actually in the mid 50s. But it's funny, I'll just say a quick word about this. When people think of the 60s, they think of the hippies and so on. Actually, that's really the late 60s. Early 60s, I would say, were socially quite conservative. So it's the late 60s when people think of the 60s in the conventional sense. Then you had Generation X, which were kind of a middle generation. They were a smaller generation in numbers, and apparently the research they done with this found that the people who belong to Generation X are less likely to say their generation was exceptional. So the baby boomers and the millennials are two big generations. Um, some people, say, "Oh, I wish I wasn't a millennial. I wish I wasn't part of this generation." Well, that's silly thinking because unless you get a time machine and go back in time, you're a millennial. Um, so I say just be true to yourself, believe in what you believe, and you embody part of your generation by that. If, for example, you say, "Oh, these snowflakes are always complaining," not my words, but some people would say that, then don't let them define the entire generation. Be yourself. And I think that I just don't like this negativity about, oh, the good old days were so much better and this generation is crap or this generation is. Every generation has its good and bad. I mean, people come out with these ridiculous sweeping statements that, oh, movies today are rubbish, they're all X, Y, and Z. You can't dismiss every single film produced by Hollywood or every single film in general as bad. You can't dismiss all music as bad. You can't dismiss all fashion as bad. The sort of things that we use to define a generation and a culture, political discourse. This generation is going to be remembered. This particular side of the millennial generation is going to be remembered for the rise of Trump and Brexit. Those are two aspects. Just as more earlier millennial generation, the defining events were 9/11 and the rise of Obama. So I think every generation you'll have aspects that are good and bad. Whatever way you look at it, whatever your politics are, this is the thing about generations. I think that whilst you get political traits associated with, say, the baby boomers or the millennials, um, we might find that 30 or 40 years from now, people will say this generation was socially conservative. That's incredible. The idea that the snowflake generation could be seen as socially conservative. Although what I would argue is actually the drive to censor language and language policing that we're now seeing in universities is actually quite conservative. It's not a liberal position, it's not true liberalism. So, ironically, the push for more tolerance has actually become more totalitarian in a sense. Um, for me personally, I I don't mind calling myself a millennial because that's what I am. And I have great respect and interest in some of the culture of the past. I listen to some of the artists that I like are more old school musicians. Um, some of the styles I like. I'm not particularly into cars, but I do like the Cortinas of the 70s. I think they have a cool look about them, and cars of the 50s as well. Compared to today's vehicles, to me, all look the same. Music. I'm not a massive fan of a lot of the music today, but then I do like some of the alternative music today, like electro swing, electro jazz that you find with artists like Carol Stellar. Um, I just don't think you can dismiss an entire generation. I don't think you could dismiss all music, all film. You can notice trends and you can comment on trends. But I think that if I was to say the main things I dislike about my generation, definitely the identity politics whereby everything gets defined as always just ticking boxes, and it's people are frankly too sensitive. They almost like they look for reasons to be offended in a way that maybe wasn't so prevalent in the past. That's one thing I really do dislike about this generation. I also dislike the negative aspects of social media, which you didn't have in the past, where people can be absolutely torn apart, um, tried by social media, and there's no because this is like a Frankenstein's monster. It's so big. Facebook, for example, is used by over 1 billion people. Um, I don't see any going back, so it's with us whether we like it or not. But I do wonder, 30, 40 years from now, how are we going to look back at the 2000s, at the 2010s? Those are the two decades that are the millennial decades, right? So how are we going to look back at that? How are we going to look back at the 2020s? Um, I think all you can do is be yourself. If you're interested in the past, great. I wish you all the best with that. But what I don't understand is people just dismissing the present totally and wanting to live in the past. I mean, if you're an American, would you really want to live in a time where there was segregation? And okay, the racial tensions are still there, but I think you need to look at some of the things that were going on in the past before you say it was all wonderful. There was a film actually called, I think the title was Pleasantville, made in the late 90s, with I believe it was Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon, or Kirsten Dunst, I can't remember. But I haven't seen the film, but I would like to. It's about two 1990s teenagers that go back to the 50s, and it seems great at first, but they start noticing that things aren't all great. So that's what I would say. You may think that things are great, but some things improve and some things get worse. It just, you cannot dismiss an entire generation as good or bad. As for, I'll just say a quick word, by the way, when people say, oh, this generation has sacrificed nothing, this generation is this, that, and the other. Well, I mean, young people are very politically involved, and that is good and bad. It's good in a sense that it's better than them being apathetic. I mean, when you look at young people involved in the Hong Kong protests, when you look at young people involved in the March for Our Lives demonstrations against gun violence, I have huge respect for them. And whilst I'm very critical of Extinction Rebellion, I won't say that it's bad in of itself that young people are concerned about environmental issues. Although, admittedly, I am very critical of Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, but these are things that are symbolic of our time. And so, if nothing else, young people can't be accused of being apathetic. In that sense, there are some echoes of the 60s, actually. Um, and as to the term social justice warrior, I don't use it myself. I understand the pejorative, I understand why it's used, namely for self righteous people who want to constantly lecture others. Fair enough. But as a pejorative, I'm not sure that it works because, in of itself, anyone who has some social concern is a social justice warrior of sorts. And you can call some great leaders like Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King, they were social justice warriors in a sense. Yet they're widely admired by almost everyone today. So um, I just interpret social justice warrior in in a sense that it's anyone that's concerned about social justice. Where I do see a pejorative having relevance is where you get these self-righteous people that are constantly nitpicking. And what I really have a problem with is associating genuine hate-filled racism, hate crimes, hate speech, and so on, with people who are looking for cultural appropriation. I read yesterday there was a Chinese American writer who was furious because a white writer had described Chinese people as having yellow skin and described their eyes in a certain way. And maybe it's a little bit archaic, but I didn't interpret that as racist. I interpreted that as just adjectives. I mean, I'll need to look more into it, but that's an example of people looking for reasons to be offended and people nitpicking and people being overly sensitive. I mean, if you are worked up about a cultural appropriation, you need to get out more because what you're basically saying is everyone should just stick to their own and white people should have no interest in other cultures. And yet, if they didn't, you'd be saying, oh, they're white supremacists. So you can't win with these sort of idiots who just are looking for reasons to be offended. That is an aspect of my generation, and it is largely my generation. Although some of them, I have to say, are boomers. Some of the people promoting these ideas aren't that young; they're in their 40s and 50s. I mean, some university professors who are baby boomers are the ones promoting this sort of identity politics. So it's not entirely a realm of millennials. Let me know your thoughts. Summed up, I don't think you could dismiss any entire generation as good or bad. So I get a little bit annoyed when people say, "Oh, this generation is a bunch of snowflakes." That's not true. What I was going to say actually is regarding the sacrifice thing. What about young soldiers who've done tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, risked their lives, paid with their lives in some cases? And those soldiers are millennials. You can hardly say they're snowflakes. So that's why I don't agree with this dismissing of an entire generation. Um, Let me know your thoughts.